The sky over the East African Rift Valley was doing something it hadn't done in weeks, and every creature within 20 miles noticed immediately. Around 2.3 million years ago, long before anyone invented the concept of a weather app, a small band of early humans was about to learn a very expensive lesson in meteorology, and they were going to learn it the hard way, because that's basically how every lesson got taught back then. Let's set the scene properly. This isn't the world of spears and controlled fire and cave paintings. That's still a long way off. This is the early Pleistocene, a time when the beings we're talking about were small, scrappy, and built more like marathon runners than action. They stood maybe 4.5 feet tall, weighed somewhere around 70 to 90 pounds, and had brains roughly a third the size of ours. If you lined one of them up next to a modern human, you'd notice the shorter legs, the longer arms, and a face that still had a good bit of still figuring out this whole bipedal thing energy to it. These were almost certainly members of the genus Homo, possibly Homo habilis, sometimes nicknamed handyman by paleoanthropologists, because these individuals were among the first to seriously commit to making stone tools. Whether they get to keep that title depends entirely on which fossil gets dug up next year, because this field changes its mind more often than the weather we're about to discuss. Speaking of which, let's talk about the weather, because in this story, the weather is basically the villain, and it doesn't even need a name to be terrifying. East Africa 2.3 million years ago was going through it. The climate was swinging wildly between wet and dry phases, forests were shrinking, grasslands were expanding, and the whole ecosystem was being reshuffled like a deck of cards in the hands of a caffeinated dealer. This instability is actually one of the leading theories for why bigger brains and tool use became such a good idea around this time. When your environment refuses to sit still, the individuals who can improvise tend to survive, and the individuals who can't, well, they become part of the fossil record in a much less flattering way. On this particular day, the air had that thick metallic tension that precedes a serious storm. The kind of pressure drop that makes birds go quiet and insects go loud. Our little group, let's say 6 individuals, a mix of adults and juveniles, had been out foraging since dawn, moving in that loping, energy-efficient walk that let early Homo cover impressive distances without burning through their calorie budget. And calories were the entire economy of this world. There was no such thing as a snack run. Every fruit, tuber, insect, and scrap of meat had to be earned, usually through hours of walking, digging, and occasionally getting extremely lucky. The band's foraging strategy that morning had been going reasonably well. They'd found a stand of fig trees dropping fruit, always a good sign, and one of the older females had located a termite mound that, with a little modification of a stripped twig, gave up a decent number of termites, which are basically the trail mix of the Pleistocene, high in fat and protein, mildly satisfying, and requiring absolutely zero table manners. But then the light started changing. Anyone who has been outside during a serious storm buildup knows this specific kind of light, a strange yellow-gray wash that makes the whole landscape look like it's being filtered through an old photograph. The temperature dropped. The air gets that mineral smell, sometimes called petrichor, though these individuals definitely weren't calling it that. They probably just called it the smell before the bad thing, assuming they had a word for bad thing, which honestly they probably did, because vocal communication, even if it wasn't full language yet, was almost certainly present in some form. Now here's where the humor kicks in a little, because prehistoric humans, for all their toughness, still had one very relatable trait. They did not want to get rained on any more than you do. Nobody in the history of the world has ever enjoyed being cold, wet, and stuck outside with nowhere to go. This is a universal experience that spans 2.3 million years without losing a single ounce of its misery. The dominant male of the group, we'll just call him the lead forager since names weren't exactly a thing yet, seems to have been the one who noticed first. Maybe it was the sudden hush from the bird. Maybe it was the wind shifting direction. Maybe it was simply decades, or rather years, of accumulated experience passed down informally from watching what the elders did the last time the sky looked like this. Whatever the trigger, he started moving with purpose, and the rest of the group fell in behind him almost immediately, because in a small foraging band, when one person suddenly looks worried, everyone gets worried. This is true today at a family barbecue when someone glances at the sky and says, "Did it just get darker?" And it was just as true 2.3 million years ago when the stakes were considerably higher than a ruined potato salad. The first order of business was shelter, and this is where things get genuinely interesting, because early Homo didn't build shelters the way later humans did with branches and hides lashed together into something resembling architecture. Instead, the environment itself provided the blueprint: rocky outcrops, overhangs, dense thickets, even the space beneath a fallen tree. All of these became viable options depending on what was nearby. Paleo landscape reconstructions from sites like Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania show us that these early humans were operating in a mosaic environment: patches of woodland mixed with open savanna, dotted with rocky formations that had eroded over millions of years into natural nooks and crannies. It's basically the Pleistocene version of real estate, except the only listing criteria were, does it keep water off my head, and is anything already living in there that might eat me? That second criterion mattered a lot, by the way. Caves and rock shelters were popular real estate for more than just humans. Big cats, hyenas, and other predators loved a good overhang just as much as our ancestors did, which meant every potential shelter came with a small but real chance of walking in on a leopard who had gotten there first and was not in the mood to share. This is one of those delightful little facts that makes prehistoric life sound less like an adventure movie and more like an extremely high-stakes game of guess what's behind door number 1. On this particular stormy afternoon, the group's memory of the landscape paid off. There was a rocky ridge about half a mile from where they'd been foraging, one they had used before, with a shallow overhang that could fit all 6 of them if everyone squeezed in, and nobody was picky about personal space. Personal space, it should be noted, was not really a concept yet. When your survival depends on group cohesion, you get used to sharing a small dry patch of dirt with 5 other people whether you like it or not. They moved quickly, breaking into that faster shuffle run that conserves energy while still covering ground. The kind of gait that later evolved into the endurance running that humans became famous. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how well suited the early human body already was for this kind of high-stakes travel. The legs were lengthening relative to earlier hominins. The feet had largely lost the grasping ability of tree-dwelling ancestors in favor of a stable arch built for walking and running. And the whole skeleton was being quietly optimized by evolution for exactly this kind of moment. Cover distance fast, don't waste energy, get to safety before the sky opens up. And the sky was about to open up in a big way. Storms in this part of East Africa, especially during the transitional wet-dry periods of the early Pleistocene, could be dramatic. We're talking sudden temperature drops, intense lightning, and rainfall rates that could turn a dry stream bed into a raging channel within minutes. This is actually one of the more underappreciated dangers of prehistoric storms: flash flooding. A group caught in a low-lying area or a dry riverbed, called a luga in some regional terms, could find themselves in serious trouble as water levels rose faster than anyone could react to. Geological evidence from ancient floodplain deposits in the region shows repeated flash flood events, and paleontologists studying bone assemblages have found evidence suggesting that flash floods were responsible for some mass mortality events among various species, sweeping animals into low points where their remains accumulated and fossilized together. It's a grim little reminder that nature's filing system for creatures who got caught by surprise was ruthlessly efficient. Our group fortunately knew better than to linger near the low ground. As they approached their rocky shelter, thunder started rolling in, that deep bass rumble that seems to come from everywhere at once. For a group without any understanding of atmospheric electricity, thunder must have been a genuinely unsettling experience. Less, oh, that's just static discharge, and more, the sky itself might be furious with us personally. Fear of loud, sudden noises is deeply built into the primate brain, and early Homo would have inherited that same startle response from their ancestors. A sudden crack of thunder likely sent a jolt of adrenaline through every member of the group, useful for making sure nobody dawdled on the way to shelter. They reached the overhang just as the first heavy drops began to fall, fat and warm, the kind that hit the dust and kick up little puffs before the ground gives in and starts to actually get wet. The juveniles were hustled in first, tucked against the rock wall, while the adults arranged themselves at the opening, partly to block wind and partly, frankly, because adults in every species have an instinct to put their bodies between danger and the young one. This isn't sentimentality, it's basic evolutionary math. Protecting offspring protects your genetic legacy, and any individual whose instincts didn't push them this way was, over enough generations, gradually edited out of the gene pool. Within minutes, the storm was in full swing. Rain hammered the rocky landscape, lightning lit the sky in long, jagged branches, and thunder cracked overhead with enough force to rattle loose pebbles from the overhang. Inside their shallow shelter, the group huddled together, sharing body heat, something crucial given that early Homo, without clothing or controlled fire, had very few options for staying warm besides simply pressing against each other like the world's least glamorous cuddle puddle. This kind of huddling behavior is documented in modern primates during cold or wet conditions. And it's a safe bet that our ancestors did the exact same thing, because when you don't have a blanket, your neighbor's ribs are the next thing. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Here's a fun and slightly humbling detail. Fire was not yet reliably controlled at this point in human evolution. The most widely accepted evidence for habitual fire use comes hundreds of thousands of years later, associated with species like Homo erectus. So during this particular storm, our little band had absolutely no way to dry off, warm up artificially, or scare off predators with flame. They were, in every sense of the phrase, at the mercy of the elements, relying entirely on their wits, their social bonds, and the dumb luck of finding decent shelter before things got serious. While the storm raged, there would have been a fair amount of anxious stillness. Movement outside the shelter was risky, not just because of the rain and lightning, but because storms tend to stir up wildlife in unpredictable ways. Predators sometimes use the noise and low visibility of a storm to hunt, since prey animals are distracted and disoriented, which means our group had every reason to stay tucked into their rocky nook, rather than venture out to investigate every crack of thunder. There's also the very real possibility that other animals were seeking the exact same shelter at the exact same time, which set up one of those tense wildlife standoffs nature documentaries love to dramatize. Except in this case, there were no cameras, no dramatic narrator voice, just a very damp, very nervous group of early humans hoping that the porcupine, or hyrax, or whatever else had wandered in seeking cover, wasn't interested in a confrontation. Let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer psychological toughness this situation demanded. Imagine being caught in a violent storm with no coat, no phone, no fire, and no idea how long it's going to last, while also keeping half an eye out for anything with teeth that might be sharing your hiding spot. And yet this wasn't some kind of extraordinary crisis for this group. This was a Tuesday. Storms happen, predators happen, hunger happened. Survival, for early Homo, wasn't a dramatic once-in-a-lifetime event. It was the baseline condition of existence, day in and day out, for millions of years. If you want a real definition of resilience, forget motivational posters. Just picture a family of small-brained primates weathering a lightning storm under a rock overhang with nothing but each other for warmth and a vague hope that the rain would eventually stop. As the storm intensified, the group likely fell into a kind of low hum of vocalizations, not language as we know it, but a set of grunts, calls, and gestures that conveyed reassurance, warning, and social bonding. Researchers studying primate communication suggest that early hominins had a communication system more sophisticated than modern chimpanzees, but well short of full syntax-based language. So during the storm, there may have been small vocal exchanges meant to soothe frightened juveniles, coordinate small movements within the shelter, or signal alertness if something moved nearby. It's not hard to imagine a slightly panicked juvenile letting out a distressed call every time thunder cracked, only to be gently pulled closer by an older group member in what was essentially the Pleistocene version of, "It's okay, it's just noise, go back to." Eventually, and mercifully, storms like this one tend to pass in a matter of hours rather than days. The heaviest rainfall usually clears within the first hour or two, though the aftermath, muddy ground, swollen streams, and a chilled, exhausted group of hominins would linger much longer. As the thunder rolled off into the distance and the rain thinned to a drizzle, the band would have cautiously ventured back out, testing the ground, sniffing the air, checking for immediate threats before fully committing to leaving their shelter. And this is where the story shifts from surviving the storm to dealing with the consequence. Because a storm like this doesn't just threaten you while it's happening, it reshapes the entire landscape around you afterward. For starters, foraging routes would need to be reassessed. Familiar paths might now be flooded or blocked by fallen branches. Stream beds that were dry that morning could now be raging with runoff, changing the entire calculus of where it was safe to walk. This is actually one of the underappreciated cognitive demands placed on early Homo. Not just reacting to immediate danger, but constantly updating a mental map of an environment that refuses to hold still. Every storm, every dry season, every migration of prey, Animals meant the map in their heads needed constant revision, and the individuals best at updating that map efficiently were the ones who ate regularly and lived long enough to pass on their genes. There's also the issue of opportunity hidden inside disaster, because nature, in its typically indifferent way, doesn't just take things away during a storm, it also occasionally hands out gifts, albeit grim ones. Flash floods and violent weather frequently kill or injure animals that couldn't escape in time, and a storm's aftermath can leave behind a scattering of carcasses ripe for scavenge. This is actually one of the compelling theories about why early Homo's diet shifted to include more animal protein around this period. Not necessarily through active hunting, which would come later and require more sophisticated tools and cooperation, but through opportunistic scavenging, especially after events like storms or floods that incapacitated or killed other animals. So it's entirely plausible that as our little band emerged from their shelter, damp, cold, and hungry, they stumbled across exactly this kind of opportunity. Perhaps a small antelope caught by rising floodwaters or an animal injured by a falling branch during the height of the storm. If so, this is where those stone tools we mentioned earlier come back into the story, because Oldowan tools, the simple but genuinely revolutionary flaked stone implements associated with early Homo, were perfectly suited for exactly this kind of situation. A sharp flake could slice through hide that their teeth and nails simply couldn't manage, opening up access to meat, marrow, and organs, all of which are calorie-dense resources that would have been an absolute jackpot after a stressful, foodless afternoon spent sheltering from a storm. Cut marks on ancient animal bones found at sites like Olduvai Gorge give us direct physical evidence of this behavior. Some of these bones even show tooth marks from carnivores layered underneath or over the cut marks made by stone tools, which lets researchers piece together a rough sequence of events. Sometimes early Homo got to a carcass first, and tools left their marks before scavengers moved in, and sometimes it happened the other way around, with our ancestors swooping in to grab whatever scraps larger predators had left behind. It's not the most dignified way to build a food chain reputation, but dignity has never been a particularly useful survival trait. Getting enough calories to keep your brain running, on the other hand, absolutely is. There's a wonderfully unglamorous truth hiding in all of this. So much of early human survival came down to being flexible opportunists rather than dominant predators. We like to imagine our ancestors as scrappy hunters bravely taking down big game, but the reality, at least at this stage in human evolution, was closer to extremely efficient garbage collectors with unusually good problem-solving skills. And honestly, there's something almost comforting about that. Humanity's ancient origin story isn't one of conquering the food chain through brute strength. It's one of surviving through adaptability, cooperation, and the willingness to seize any opportunity a chaotic environment happened to offer. Even if that opportunity came wrapped in mud and storm water, once the group had, let's say, secured a bit of unexpected protein from the storm's aftermath, the rest of the day would have been spent recovering. Wet fur, or rather wet skin, and the light body hair that likely still covered much of early Homo needed drying out, ideally in whatever patches of sun broke through the clearing cloud. Juveniles probably clung close to adults for warmth and reassurance, still processing the noise and chaos of the storm in whatever way a small hominin brain processed trauma. And the group as a whole would have taken stock of who was present, who wasn't, and whether anyone had been injured during the chaotic scramble to shelter. This social bookkeeping mattered enormously. In a group this small, losing even one member to injury or predation was a massive blow, both emotionally in whatever capacity these early humans experienced emotional bonds, and practically in terms of the group's overall foraging efficiency and defensive capability. Small hominin bands thrived on cooperation, shared vigilance, and mutual support. And this wasn't some kind of noble ideal, it was a cold, hard requirement for staying alive in an environment absolutely stuffed with predators, unpredictable weather, and constant food scarcity. As evening approached and the storm became nothing more than a distant rumble on the horizon, the group would have begun settling in for the night, likely returning to a familiar sleeping area, possibly even the same rocky overhang, now considerably safer with the storm's threat past. Night in the Pleistocene savanna carried its own set of dangers, primarily from nocturnal predators like big cats, so shelter choice mattered just as much after a storm as during one. It's worth pointing out here just how much environmental knowledge a single storm event like this would reinforce and pass down through the group. Younger members watching how the adults reacted, which shelters were chosen, how quickly the group moved, which paths were avoided. All of this became part of an informal curriculum, passed down not through spoken instruction, but through observation and imitation. This is one of the quietly remarkable aspects of early human culture. Knowledge transmission didn't require language in the modern sense. It required attention, memory, and repeated exposure to the same lessons across multiple storms, multiple seasons, multiple close calls with predators. Over time, these repeated lessons became deeply ingrained behavioral patterns, the kind of instinctive knowledge that let a group react quickly and correctly the very next time the sky started turning that ominous yellow-gray. If we zoom out from this single storm and consider the broader picture, the fact that Homo habilis, or whichever early Homo species this specific group belonged to, survived and eventually gave rise to later, more advanced human species tells us something important. This adaptability, this capacity to read environmental cues, make quick group decisions, use simple tools opportunistically, and rely on social cohesion for both physical and emotional survival, this was the actual engine of human evolutionary success. It wasn't brute strength, it wasn't size, it was flexibility, cooperation, and the ability to learn from an environment that was constantly testing them. And in a strange way, weathering a storm like this one is a perfect microcosm of the entire human evolutionary story. Faced with something bigger and more powerful than themselves, something they had no ability to control or even fully understand, this small band of early humans didn't panic into paralysis. They read the signs, they moved quickly, they used their environment intelligently, they leaned on each other for warmth and safety, and they even managed to turn a portion of the disaster into an opportunity. If that's not a strong contender for the original human survival strategy, it's hard to imagine what would be. There's also something quietly poetic about the fact that lightning, thunder, and torrential rain, forces so far beyond the comprehension of a small-brained hominin 2.3 million years ago, are still forces we don't fully control today. Even with all our technology and science, we've built better shelters, sure, and we've got radar systems and weather satellites and phone alerts buzzing 30 minutes before a storm even arrives. But at the end of the day, when the thunder cracks directly overhead, there's still a small, ancient part of the human brain that flinches exactly the way it did 2.3 million years ago. That instinctive jolt of alertness, that little surge of "stay alert, this matters," it's a direct evolutionary echo from groups just like the one we've been describing. So the next time a storm rolls in and you find yourself glancing nervously out the window, take a moment to appreciate the sheer depth of history behind that instinct. You're not just feeling weather anxiety, you're channeling a survival strategy that's been fine-tuned over millions of years, refined generation after generation by ancestors who had no roof, no fire, no tools beyond a few sharpened stones, and absolutely no choice but to figure it out as they went along. They didn't have meteorologists, they didn't have Doppler radar. What they had was sharp observation, tight social bonds, a body built for endurance, and just enough cleverness with stone tools to turn even a dangerous storm into a chance for a decent meal. And honestly, when you consider everything working against them, no fire, no clothing, no permanent shelter, brains a third the size of ours, and predators lurking at every rocky overhang worth hiding in. The fact that this specific lineage not only survived that storm, but survived millions of years of storms just like it, eventually giving rise to every single human being alive today, is nothing short of remarkable. Every time you complain about getting caught in the rain without an umbrella, just remember, your ancestors did it with considerably higher stakes, considerably fewer resources, and absolutely no complaining allowed, because complaining doesn't keep the rain off, and it definitely doesn't scare away a leopard.